Twitter, announcing they are permanently banning Donald Trump from their platforms. You can see here, Real Donald Trump account suspended, and this is permanent.
Twitter is planning to permanently suspend Alex Jones's personal account at InfoWars. That they took this action based on reports of tweets and videos posted yesterday that violated their abusive behavior policy, in addition to previous violations that they saw on that account.
It's time for a real digital Bill of Rights. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, they're now the town square. We need to have the free speech rules that apply to speech in an actual town square apply here.
And what you're seeing now is a lot of people on the left really are starting to have that enlightenment moment. Because the way this was originally pitched to us, it was in a package that a lot of people found attractive. And the package was, oh my God, Alex Jones is so bad. Look at the stuff he's doing. We can't possibly tolerate him on the platform. Wouldn't it be great if we just totally banned him? And a lot of people on the left were like, I fucking hate that guy. That guy's the worst. That guy's an abuser. That guy's an harasser. He's got to go. He's got to go. And so what people didn't realize is you just agreed to a principle that's going to destroy you and your own.
Well, friends, it looks like we're in a bit of a pickle. Because in a worryingly short period of time, multiple things have happened to call into question one of the most fundamental principles of liberal democracy, freedom of speech. Does Twitter have the right to ban a sitting president? Is YouTube morally obligated to stop misinformation on its site? Should a democracy tolerate anti-democracy voices? Has big tech become a second government? More abstractly, is the free speech of 2021 the same as the free speech of 1789? All of these questions have been posed to us as a nation in the span of less than a year. And even though many pundits on either side would say otherwise, the issue is honestly really complicated. And it's the fact that it's such a complicated issue that led me to want to make a video about it. Because honestly, it doesn't feel like a satisfactory answer can be summed up without serious reflection on some of our society's most fundamental values. So in order to better answer our question, that's what we're going to have to do in this video. Part 1. Why do we have free speech? So, I have had enough coffee to get me through this philosophical bullshit, and I am ready to talk about old, white, ancient blowhards like John Locke. So, our boy John Locke was around in the late 1600s and the early 1700s when, dinosaurs were still roaming the earth, and this time period led him to write wonderful sentences such as, "For what can give laws to another must needs be superior to him, and since the legislative is no otherwise legislative of the society, but by right it has to make laws for all the parts, and every member of the society prescribing rules to their actions, they are transgressed. The legislative must needs be supreme, and all other powers in any members or parts of the society derived from and subordinate to it." That's a sentence. Just one. Just a sentence. Yeah, this guy is a bit frustrating to read, but if you recall from your high school American government classes, he was pretty influential on the founders of these blessed United States, so unfortunately, hearing what he said about freedom of speech would be necessary if we hope to examine the concept in the abstract. Weirdly enough, though, John Locke never really talked specifically about freedom of speech in his two treatises on government, which was a foundational text for liberalism. Instead, freedom of speech necessarily followed from his thoughts on liberty, particularly in the chapter of the state of nature. Essentially, Locke argues that in a completely equal, ungoverned state, or a state of nature, there's still a natural law. In a state of absolute freedom, a person has control over their body, and this state of nature is defiled when someone inflicts harm on another's control over their body. He says that, quote, "In transgressing the law of nature, the offender declares himself to live by another rule than that of reason." And there's more to the argument, but I think you can see where it's going. And the reason that it led the founders and other liberal thinkers of the time to apply it to the concept of speech is that obviously part of the natural control over one's body is the control over one's speech. In a vacuum, I can say whatever I please unless there's someone, a governing power, to stop me. What follows then, if we accept Locke's arguments, is that restricting a person's natural control over their speech is doing some kind of harm to them, which should be avoided. This is the philosophical backing for much of the First Amendment, along with his social contract theory, which I will assume that you've all heard of. But what does this mean in practice? It's easy to talk about philosophy and kind of get lost in the woods of, philosophical abstract reasoning, but what does this actually mean, particularly in modern American society? What is the modern argument for freedom of speech? Essentially, in modern discourse, we consider our nation ideally to be a democracy, and each act of censorship brings us further away from that ideal. In American discourse, a lot of people believe that democracy is when each voice is represented and judged by the will of the voters. To many Americans, restricting the opinions of people is a slippery slope leading towards tyranny, including the restrictions implemented by tech companies against hate speech, harassment, and conspiracy theories. To proponents, protecting against that slippery slope is why we have freedom of speech. We will examine that further in Part 2, Free Speech Has Changed. So let's return to Locke for a second. Remember his argument. It's a type of harm to restrict a person's natural freedoms. But this didn't just apply to speech. It also applied to property. To Locke, property or possession was also a natural right of human beings. From this, we have two more abstract statements. First, that doing unprovoked harm onto others is something that we should avoid. And second, that this freedom applies also to what one does with their property. And my friends, it looks like we've run into a conflict when looking at this in the context of modern society. On the one hand, doing what I want with my property is to lock a natural right of mine. On the other, if I use my property to harm others, I have engaged in some kind of wrongdoing. At the time, this would have been a rare and insignificant occurrence. But nowadays, corporations have grown so powerful that their internal regulations affect in many cases the majority of the whole population. So which should the freedom-loving, God-fearing Lockean prioritize? The right of property owners to hold dominion over their property, or the right of users not to have their natural liberties restricted? And given the previous idea that restriction of speech is a form of harm, according to Locke, it seems we're at quite the impasse. And the fact that this wasn't something to be considered at the time is what I mean when I say that freedom of speech has changed. Freedom of speech in the 18th century meant that I, as a citizen, could go to the town square and decry the actions of my government. Even if I used that right at the time to spread lies, my reach just wouldn't have had the capacity to inflict enough damage to require much regulation past slander, libel, and sedition laws. Does that sound like the world we live in today? If you have an honest bone in your body, you will say no. In the age of QAnon, anti-vax, and people who believe that Donald Trump will be president again any day now, it's clear that the character of speech has changed. At the beginning of the pandemic, a pseudo-documentary was released that insinuated that somehow COVID was created to set in motion some kind of plan to further control the masses. This video, whose name I won't share because I don't want to give them publicity, went viral, and I mean viral, millions of views, millions of shares. How much damage did that do? How many elderly or immunocompromised people died because someone didn't wear a mask around them, thinking that they were revolutionary for doing so? How many elderly will die because they don't want the vaccine, which is proven to very effectively build immunity against the virus? That is a perfect example of the reach our voices have in the digital age, doing serious harm to society as a whole, likely causing deaths. But like I said at the beginning of the video, it isn't the only example in the past year of misinformation doing serious harm. Yeah, I'm talking about that. January 6th. Here you have a crowd of thousands believing that they are somehow protecting democracy by demanding Congress stop counting votes. That happened. This event was, to me, a signifier of the flimsiness of liberal democracy. It was a far-right insurrection built on only a few months of lies, and these lies would not have done the damage they did, even with Trump in office, had the character of speech been the same as it was at our nation's founding. And make no mistake, it is clear that these people did mean to do harm. Had they broken into the House chamber, as one protester who was shot almost did, they most certainly would have done harm in some form to the lawmakers that Trump supporters love to hate, such as AOC, Ilhan Omar, who some of these people think is here illegally, and others. So here we have amplified speech leading directly to the harm of others. And it's that amplification that makes such occurrences so commonplace in the modern age. And I think that our conversations about speech and freedom of speech should reflect that, if we're being honest. So to return to the impasse, Lockean philosophy and the language of the founders really don't have an answer for this problem, but we can infer as to what an extension of liberal regulation might look like in the modern age. Remember, the founders didn't institute a policy of absolute freedom of speech. There were some caveats. Slander and libel is the big one. I can't legally besmirch the reputation of a public figure with my writings or my speech without proper evidence. In other words, I can't lie about them. This restriction on speech is as old as the country itself and is in place to prevent direct harm caused by speech. Well, shit, there's our answer. Restriction of harmful speech is as American as apple pie. And if we're going off of what the founders and the early liberal thinkers said, we would certainly want to curtail speech that causes the harm we've just described. So what's the problem? Well, simply put, Enlightenment liberalism isn't the framework most free speech proponents are working off of. The philosophy of free speech absolutism has grown pretty vapid as the distance between us and John Locke has widened. So take from this part of the video at least that the discourse of freedom of speech today is not at all based in the Enlightenment Lockean ideals that the nation was founded upon. If we adequately want to address the concerns of people today, I guess we have to come up with our own solutions, which leads me to Part 3. Modern free speech discourse. TM. Alright, all this liberalism is making me lose brain cells. Remember, we are socialists here at Elias the Commie LLC, and I can only take so much Locke and Constitution before my brain reaches a rolling boil. Anyway, a lot of the discourse about freedom of speech today exists in the context of big tech, which further shows just how much the character of speech has changed. One of the questions posed by this era that I mentioned at the beginning of the video is whether the big technology firms are acting as a second government, and honestly, yeah, they kind of are. When you have people like Kamala Harris using some of her time in the Democratic primary debates demanding that Trump be banned from Twitter, it goes to show the extent of the embeddedness of social media in today's politics. And this embeddedness means that the decisions regarding who is and is not allowed on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube is in effect a decision regarding the political influence of the people in question. And a decision of that magnitude being left up to a corporation is certainly unnerving, but there is some nuance to be had here. Any company which oversees a space, physically or digitally, is allowed in America to regulate its space, and has had that right since the nation's founding, more or less. But I think it's fair to say that being banned from some tiny independent forum board is not the same politically as being banned from the biggest social media sites in existence, which reach billions of people. Because they've always had this right, though, it makes me roll my eyes when I hear people like Kyle Kulinski using the slippery slope argument that somehow Alex Jones being banned means the left channels are now going to be banned. In reality, the banning of people on Twitter and YouTube has never been a slippery slope. It's more of a constant as old as the sites themselves. The problem here isn't Twitter or YouTube's power to ban, it's Twitter and YouTube's power in general. Any company the size of Twitter, Facebook, or Google wields too much power over the political sphere, just as ExxonMobil, Goldman Sachs, and Blue Cross Blue Shield wield too much power over the political sphere. It's not a big tech problem. It's a capitalism problem. And yet I did say that there was nuance. To explore that nuance, let's look at Queen Mother of BreadTube ContraPoints' recent Twitter thread on YouTube censorship that we saw in the beginning of the video. So she says, 3 years and 4 million views after upload, today YouTube has age restricted my video incels. Age restriction significantly reduces a video's visibility, requiring viewers to be logged in and over 18 to watch, and suppressing it in the recommendation algorithm. YouTube's community guidelines are supposed to make it clear to creators what content is allowed on the platform, but the guidelines are enforced very arbitrarily, actually worse than arbitrarily. Video restriction/removal is often triggered by an easily abused flagging system. Randomly enforced restrictions are more restrictive than ones that are consistently enforced. If enforcement is consistent, you know what the rules are and you can work around them. But arbitrary enforcement forces you into superstitious, neurotic self-censorship. You don't know what exactly you can get away with, so you start bleeping, blurring, and omitting anything that could possibly be evocative of sex, drugs, violence, profanity, hate speech, or bullying. This is bad for art. Suppose you're a history YouTuber. Can you show images of Nazi Germany for educational purposes? Images often shown in school to under 18s? According to the community guidelines, yes, but in practice such videos are often restricted or removed for hate speech. Suppose you're a feminist or sex educator. Can you say the words pornography, rape, clitoris? YouTube is often the only chance to educate teenagers about these topics before Pornhub does. But on YouTube, this kind of content is very often age restricted. Because most of my funding comes from Patreon, I'm in the fortunate position of not being financially reliant on the erratic whims of this broken system, so I can afford to take risks. But most creators aren't so lucky. Free speech should be reclaimed as an essential leftist issue. We should not surrender the most fundamental civil right to Google LLC in the name of deplatforming rightists and curtailing harassment. It's not worth the cost. Now, I like ContraPoints, and I think that she does really good work. And in this thread, she does raise some good points, which I'll get to in a minute. But her overarching point in the last tweet, that surrendering our free speech to Google isn't worth combating the far-right ideologues or harassment campaigns, sets up a false dichotomy, in my opinion. What I mean by that is that I don't see curtailing harassment and deplatforming fascists as something which infringes on everybody's freedom of speech, nor as something that necessarily leads to the arbitrary enforcement that she's complaining about. Now, with that being said, I do think that the enforcement on many of the sites in question is essentially arbitrary, and I would love for that not to be the case. But I also don't believe that that has to be the case either. No one has said to me, or to Natalie, or to anybody for that matter, that you have to choose either between arbitrary enforcement or a site which is friendly to rightists and harassment, and thinking that's the case is just silly. But though this isn't directly what she was talking about, I think we would also do well to explore the question of whether we should be against censorship in principle. My opinion's no. While I am, as I said before, against the power of big tech in general, just as I'm against the power of all other large corporations, I would also recognize that even entities whose existence I advocate against can do something I agree with. Imagine if Corporation X committed to donating $500 million to fighting climate change. Does that fix climate change? No. Does that mean corporations are good? No. Does that action exist for any reason outside of PR and profit? No. But does it also mean that there are $500 million more in the fight against climate change than there were before? Yes, I am allowed to be against the existence of corporations and still recognize the marginal good some actions, even by corporations, may cause. I would also note that human beings are capable of separating more than one event in their brains. I can say that one action by a corporation is bad while another is good. So if we apply these concepts to the example of censorship, it's almost like I, a human being with a brain capable of basic reasoning, can simultaneously be against arbitrary enforcement of rules while also being for the combating of misinformation. Isn't that crazy? But with all that being said, I think that most can agree that something is wrong. What we have now isn't ideal, far from it. Near trillion-dollar corporations are not my first pick for regulating our political discourse, and an internet turned into a breeding ground for white supremacists and fascists is hardly a runner-up. So I think we should use the last few minutes in this video to confront the question that I think is on everybody's mind at the end of this. Part 4. What changes should be made? Well, I think that the most glaringly obvious thing that we can do in the short term is what it seemed like ContraPoints was leaning into when she said that randomly enforced restrictions are more restrictive than the ones that are consistently enforced. In fact, I found it kind of surprising that she didn't just stop there. The obvious solution is for bigger creators on YouTube and bigger accounts on Facebook and Twitter to push for a more manually controlled, consistent restriction system that sets clear guidelines for users. The problem with that, though, is that obviously these sites have the ultimate say in how consistent their guidelines are enforced, what their guidelines are, and if and when they are changed. Even as a short-term solution, it feels like we're putting a lot of trust into entities that really haven't earned it. And that leads me to what I think a short or medium-term goal should be in terms of political action, namely the breaking up of the large technology companies. Many politicians have advocated this, even the moderate ones. And given that the normally pro-business Republicans have very much been rubbed the wrong way by Twitter and Google's actions, I think that this battle is more easily fought now than ever. I'm not talking about electing socialists or about revolution or about anything that would take years to build. I'm talking about a simple policy that would remove the near hegemonic power that technology giants have accumulated both in the market and in regulation of the political arena. But I want to stress the urgency of this as well. I feel like some of the left, particularly the Jimmy Dore crowd and people like that, dismisses the problem that would be caused by an unregulated internet. Much of Trump's cult-like support was built on lies that were artificially spread like wildfire, not the least of which is the lie that Donald Trump somehow won the election, but also that even in the 2016 election, millions of illegal immigrants were the people who pushed Hillary Clinton over the top in the popular vote. But there is worse than even that. Such extreme ideologies as modern racist pseudoscience, neo-Nazism, fascism, and others are spread by the likes of Paul Joseph Watson, Alex Jones, and Nick Fuentes, and relegating them to a tiny corner of the internet greatly diminishes their power to fuck things up even worse. That's why I see the need for a short-term solution to be had even within the capitalist nightmare we find ourselves in, because I simply don't see a reality where socialists can flourish to build a new, more just society without an even bigger bigger fascist crowds who meet them in a completely unregulated space. But again, at Allies to Commie LLC, we are socialists, and I am allowed to dream about whatever I want on my channel, so I want to repeat that this really is just a capitalist problem. Capitalists have been regulating the political discourse long before social media came into being. The push to consolidate media was born long before that, and lobbying regulates what politicians can and cannot say, and we saw that at the beginning of the 20th century. In other words, the problem does not begin and end with big tech. The ruling class is a conscious one, meaning they, being small in number, know exactly what their interests are, and will use whatever power they have to make sure that the discourse does not heavily favor a threat to their bottom line. And for that reason, I think we should keep in mind that even when Google or Twitter bans crappy people, and even if they reform for better, more consistent terms of service, they're not our friends. Treating them like a hostile entity that needs to be pushed to do the right thing is the best course of action, and the most accurate one, in my opinion. Okay, that is everything that I have for this. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I wanted to go more in depth than I feel like pretty much everybody else has been, because I feel like a lot of the philosophical backing, the sort of inconsistencies in the conversations that people are having on both sides of this debate, I feel like a lot of it gets left out. So I wanted to at least put my thoughts out there. Apparently I have a lot of thoughts though, because we're at like 19 minutes of audio. But yeah, I want to be posting more. I'm going to try to post more because the semester is almost over. So it's been real, and I will see you whenever the next time is, hopefully soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.